Hello, today I'm going to talk about the nuclear arms race and the space race from the Cold War. And by the end of this presentation, I would like to answer this question. To what extent did ideological conflict affect international relations after the Second World War during the nuclear arms race and the space race? So to put the context, this was a map of what the Cold War was fighting for, with Warsaw of the red side and NATO of the blue. And during the Cold War, the two biggest competitors were the United States and the Soviet Union. As during the Cold War, two of the most important events between these two countries were the space race and the nuclear arms race, as the winner of it will show which country had the most advanced technology, science, and global leverage. Some key people that were involved in the Cold War was the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. Known as a dictator, after World War II, Stalin was committed to instill his ideologies onto Eastern Europe and saw this as a way to fight against the West, which was the main factors of why the Cold War started. Another key person was the successor of Stalin, Nikita Khrushchev. When he led the Soviet Union during the early stages of the Cold War, his actions were to build more nuclear missiles to fight and keep up with the United States, and he was also involved with the Cuban Missile Crisis. While for the United States, one of the most influential people during the Cold War was John F. Kennedy, although he was only in presidency for 3 years due to being assassinated. As a president, he has stopped the Cuban Missile Crisis from escalating and also had two famous speeches. One of them was for the space race, which he wanted to be the first country to step on the moon, and another was for the argument of the Berlin Wall and show the flaws of communism. The nuclear race started right after World War II as it became the biggest tension between the two countries. As during the World War II, the United States used 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. And by 1950, both countries had enough bombs to create a situation of mutual assured destruction, also known as MAD, which meant that they could both destroy each other in case of a war. On August 29, 1949, Russia created the first successful atomic bomb, and with the world shocked by the speed on Russian weapons development, the arms race began. By 1952, the United States created an even stronger bomb named a hydrogen bomb, and Russia followed it the next year. As weapon development continued to increase, both sides started to fear what would happen if war broke out again, which has caused more technological advancement in defensive systems such as radar arrays or defensive missiles to stop incoming attacks, or even nuclear bunkers to protect government or high officials from these nuclear attacks. But by the 1970s, the arms race started to die down as it became very costly for both countries, as by the end of the Cold War, 27% of Russia's GDP was used on military. Both sides began talks for easing the relations with SALT, also known as Strategic Arms Limitation Talk agreements, to slow down the arms race. And by 1991, the arms race and the Cold War were, for the most part, ended as the Soviet Union has fallen apart. The space race first started prior to 1955, when the two competitors realized how rocket research would benefit the military, and with the help of German rocket scientists acquired after World War II, the space race has begun. The first challenge was to put a satellite in space, which both countries have announced during the time that they would send satellites into orbit in the foreseeable future, which sparked the race. And on October 4, 1957, the Russians were the first to have a successful satellite in orbit, which is shown in the picture in the bottom left. The next challenge was to be the first man in orbit, which was also run by the Russians on April 12, 1961, when Yuri Gagarin was the first man to orbit Earth. Unhappy after being beaten in both competitions by the Russians, during a Congress in 1961, American President John F. Kennedy announced with an ambitious goal that he would be the first country to put a man on the moon. 8 years and dozens of experiments and test flights after, with newly created programs of Gemini and Apollo by the Americans. In July 20, 1969, 3 days after NASA has sent Apollo 11 into space, Apollo 11 had finally arrived on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon with his famous quote, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And by the end of the 1960s, with multiple failed attempts by the Russians to land on the moon, and the first joint missions with the Americans, in 1975, it is safe to say that the space war was over. So in conclusion, although the Cold War was started due to the American concern of Joseph Stalin's communist Soviet Union and his tyrannical rule of his own country, I believe that after the events of the nuclear arms race and the space race, the relations between the two countries have gotten better. As examples such as before Kennedy was assassinated, there were reports saying that the Russians and the Americans were discussing to work together to put a man on the moon. But after he was killed, the Russians backed off the joint venture, which was only delayed until 1975 when they had the first joint venture. Or the detente between USA and Soviet Union due to both countries' fear of destroying each other, which resulted in SALT agreement.